recap where all this came from. Long ago, back in July, I think it was, Stephanie asked, initially it was me and Stefan Waligur to develop a course that focused on the theme of harvest, since it's a course that's offered in the harvest season. And since we were already doing a service that was supposed to arise out of Exodus 16, we thought, well, we'll just let the course arise out of that as well. One of the things that's noteworthy in Exodus 16 is that there appear to be two different things that I've called economies, and I'll say a little bit more about what I mean by economy in a minute. So the course that we're involved in now, that we're involved in the second meeting of, began from that request, develop something that's appropriate for harvest. So looking at Exodus 16, there were a couple of things that stood out. One, the notion of the thing that we call manna, the word manna in its Hebrew iteration means like, what's that? And so it's a story about people who look at this thing that God gives them and they say, what's that? And in some portions of the text, the thing that God gives them is actually referred to as the presence of God. So in some sense, it looks like these people are looking at the presence of God and saying, what's that? And although that seems, bizarre, the truth is that I can relate to that. I think I look at the presence of God a lot and I say, what's that? So that came along with the realization that the principal Jewish festival that celebrates harvest is called the Festival of Sukkot, which is also known as the Festival of Booths or Tabernacles, because during that time, what Jews are invited to do is to essentially build little huts for themselves and move out of their permanent houses into their huts. And the whole idea is that they are supposed to reenact the era in their cultural history when they were most vulnerable. So the idea of a harvest festival is somehow linked to remembering and in some sense celebrating our vulnerability. So it was those two sort of pieces of textual analysis and also religious history that sort of brought forward this thinking about different kinds of economy. And then finally, we sort of crystallized around the idea that in some ways Exodus 16 could serve as a framework for considering the current circumstances of the Christian church at large. Maybe not so much the circumstances of Trinity Presbyterian, which I think all of us would probably agree is not is an extraordinary Christian congregation, but I think the Christian church writ large can be usefully sort of considered through the framework of Exodus 16. So there are four questions that guide my thinking about this material, and that I invite all of you to consider as we look first again briefly at Exodus 16 and then at 1 Kings. And those questions are here. The first question, what do the people want? And then the second question, why do they want that? Or another way to say that would be, what does their wanting it suggest to us? And the third question, what does God want? And then why does God want that? Or what does God's wanting that suggest to us? And those four questions really, I think, are the framework for trying to use this material, both the Exodus material and the material in 1 Kings, and then next week, the material in Amos and the book of Ruth. For using that material as a way for us to think not only about this ancient vision, but about our contemporary, our current moment. What do the people want? Why do they want that? What does God want? And why does God want that? So I invite you to keep those four questions at the forefront of your mind as we go forward. So there are some touchstones for our contemplation of these questions, and I've organized them under the headings economy of exploitation and economy of dependence. Those touchstones are, as we've just said, these portions of Exodus. And the reason that I added Exodus 21 and 23 is that it seems apparent that the regulations that are listed in Exodus 21 and 23, or 21 through 23, somehow speak to the kind of economy, if you will, that the people of Israel are experiencing in this moment of vulnerability. So those laws are a response to, or a way to try and address the vulnerability that they're feeling at that time. And then the primary examples of exploitation are what we see in 1 Kings. And Amos, of course, is a response to the exploitation that we'll see in 1 Kings. The flip side of that is the economy of dependence. I know that dependence is a word that most of us recoil from. I think that that's an American thought habit. We've been taught to think about dependence as something that's, that's undesirable. But I'm going to suggest that this text actually wants us to think about, actually wants us to embrace dependence. And the touchstones for that way of looking at the God-human relationship, and for that way of looking at our own lives, are the book of Ruth and the first part of the book of Isaiah. And then in our final meeting together, we'll jump forward and we'll look at a section of the Gospel of Matthew, probably mostly the Sermon on the Mount, and we'll look at a couple of passages from Paul, who I would suggest is like the epitome of that economy of dependence. Ways to think about what we're doing here. So Ellen Davis is someone I've mentioned a lot. I know Mary Lou has heard me mention her ad nauseum. She's a theologian, a teacher at the Duke Divinity School, and she thinks a lot about the connection between agrarian life and Old Testament theology. So she said a couple of things here that I think are really useful ways to think about what we're doing together. The first, she says the poet's art, or her gift, and she means both the gift that she received and the gift that she confers to other people, is to bring words into conformity with the God-given facts of material reality, thus making their harmonies perceptible. That I think is a really articulate way to wrap our heads around what it is we're trying to do when we read the Bible in some way that is not simply to see what it says, but rather to make sense of it for our lives. So I begin with the assumption that we're all here because we've found that the Bible can help us make sense of our own lives, but that in order for it to do that, we have to engage in a pretty substantial process of interpretation. So Ellen Davis's quote about the poet's art, I think, describes what we're doing when we read the Bible in that way. We are bringing words into conformity with the God-given facts of material reality. And we're doing that in a way that makes the harmony between those God-given facts and our words perceptible. In other words, we're trying to point out for ourselves the harmony between what is and what we say about what is. I know that's kind of vague and abstract, but the more I think about that, the more I think, yeah, that's what we're doing. We're bringing language into conformity with the reality we perceive. The other thing Ellen Davis says, the aim of liturgy and poetry, so she talked about the poet's art, now she's saying the aim of poetry is to help us discern the presence and the action of God in our particular circumstances, and to seek and become receptive to the gifts of God befitting this place and this situation. And I think that that's very important, because this place and this situation are entirely different from the place and situation that gave rise to the material that we're going to read. And I think we need to be mindful of that, in order to make sense of this material in some way that's actually functional for our current moment. So all of that being said, I will also acknowledge from the outset that I generally assume that what we're reading is not simply a recording of what happened, but rather it is the effort of many, many people over many, many centuries to make sense of the God-given facts of their material reality. If it were a simple record of what happened, there wouldn't be a whole lot for us to say about it or to do with it. But if we accept it as something other than a record, as an effort to make sense, well, then suddenly it offers us the opportunity to make sense of our moment as well. A couple more things here, and then I'll stop talking. So I've used this word economy. And economy, I think, may not have been the best choice for the idea that I'm thinking of. But what I mean by economy is this. So economy is the system by which a group of people meets its needs. So that's the way I'm using the word economy. Our economy is the way we meet our needs, both individually and collectively. And there are certain assumptions that have to underlie that system. So in order for the system to meet my needs and for it to work as a group, there are certain assumptions that we all have to, kind of accept and agree on. And then there are some consequences to those assumptions. So those are the sorts of things that I hope we'll wind up seeing as we work through some of this material. This quotation speaks, I think, to, what would we say, to the circumstances of composition of this text in a way that I think is, again, fruitful to remember. So maybe I'll step back at this point and give a little bit of textual history. The passages from Exodus that we're going to read, and also the passages from First Kings that we're going to read, are largely attributed to an entity that's known as the priestly school or the priestly writers. And those are mostly people who have survived the exile of the Israelites in Babylon and then been allowed to return to their homeland and try to rebuild their country. So a quick history lesson. The archaeologists and historians believe that that David was crowned king of Israel in about the year 950 BCE, and that he reigned for about 40 years, and that then Solomon was crowned king of Israel in about the year 910, 900 BCE, and he reigned for about another 40 years. And then after Solomon, the kingdom of Israel split into two. It became the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south. And it was never again reunited as one political entity. The kingdom of Israel in the north fell to the Assyrians in about the year 725 BCE. And the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, fell not to the Assyrians, but to the Babylonians in about the year 650 BCE. So that's the time frame that we're looking at. Most of the texts that we're going to read are composed of elements that are very, very old, like pieces of song and little scraps of story, which have been organized by editors or redactors who, as I said, lived during the period of time after Babylon had fallen to the Persians, and the Persians allowed the Jews to go back home. So the people who wrote these texts have witnessed this sweep of history Their culture has in fact risen to the cultural heights in Palestine, and it has then been defeated and been exiled, and then, much to everybody's surprise, allowed to return. So when they're lifting up this material in front of us, they lift it up as people who already know the future. And I think it's crucial to bear that in mind. One of the things that seems clear about the Israelites is that in contrast to their more fortunate neighbors, they never had enough water or arable land to waste. They managed to establish themselves in the steep, rocky hill country because it was the only part of the land of Canaan that nobody else wanted. So these people claimed the land that was, in effect, undesirable. They survived as farmers by becoming intimate with their land, by learning to meet its expectations and its needs, and by passing on their knowledge with each generation, serving as the human seed stock indispensable for the well-being of the next. So what I've just described there is a particular kind of economy. That is, that's the system by which those people met their needs. And the crucial part of it is that there was never enough leeway for them to waste anything. You know, they survived only by learning, as this writer says, to meet the land's expectations and its needs, and by passing on their knowledge from one generation to the next. So we can take that vision of Israelite economy back into what we're going to look at in Exodus 16, and then we'll look at that again when we come to 1 Kings. Factors for focusing our attention here. Remind ourselves that the text reached its current form after the Israelite empire fell to Babylon, and that it's a construction that's whose purpose is to make sense of the material reality that they find in front of them. And then a question that I would ask is, what kind of culture or economy created the need for that text? In other words, what was it in these people's experience that made them need to say what they said? Again, I'm presuming that it's not merely a recording, it's a selection. All right, that was a long buildup. I'm sorry for that. So I'm going to unshare my screen. And I'm gonna invite us to go back quickly to Exodus 16, just to refresh our memories. So in order for me to, yield the floor for a minute, will somebody read for us, let's say, the first 20 verses of Exodus 16?
The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the Sin. Is it Sin or Shin? How do they pronounce it?
I'd say Sin, but
Sin Desert, which is located between Elim and Sinai. They set out on the 15th day of the second month after they had left the land of Egypt. The whole Israelite community complained against Moses and Aaron in the desert. The Israelites said to them, "Oh, how we wish that the Lord had just put us to death while we were still in the land of Egypt. There we could sit by the pots cooking meat and eat our fill of bread. Instead, you've brought us out into this desert to starve this whole assembly to death." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I'm going to make bread rain down from the sky for you. The people will go out each day and gather just enough for that day. And this way, I'll test them to see whether or not they follow my instruction. On the sixth day, when they measure out what they have collected, it will be twice as much as they have collected on other days." So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "This evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you will see the Lord's glorious presence, because your complaints against the Lord have been heard." "Who are we? Why blame us?" Moses continued. "The Lord will give you meat to eat in the evening and your fill of bread in the morning, because the Lord heard the complaints you made against him. Who are we? Your complaints aren't against us, but against the Lord." Then Moses said to Aaron, say to the whole Israelite community, come near to the Lord, because he's heard your complaints. As Aaron spoke to the whole Israelite community, they turned to look toward the desert. And just then the glorious presence of the Lord appeared in the cloud. The Lord spoke to Moses, I've heard the complaints of the Israelites. Tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will have your fill of bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God. In the evening, a flock of quail flew down and covered the camp. And in the morning, there was a layer of dew all around the camp. When the layer of dew lifted, there on the desert surface were thin flakes, as thin as frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, what is it? They didn't know what it was. Moses said to them, this is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Collect as much of it as each of you can eat, 1 omer per person. You may collect for the number of people in your household. The Israelites did as Moses said, some collecting more, some less. But when they measured it out by the omer, the ones who had collected more had nothing left over, and the ones who had collected less had no shortage. Everyone collected just as much as they could eat. Moses said to them, don't keep any of it until morning. But they didn't listen to Moses. Gee, isn't that a surprise? Some kept part of it until morning, but it became infested with worms and stank. Moses got angry with them.
Okay, there's so much going on here. I'll restrain myself and try to limit myself to just a couple of things. And I urge you all, interrupt me whenever you would like. So the things that jump out at me, it sounds like the Israelites are being, ungrateful wretches in verse 3. The Israelites said, oh, if only we had died by the hand of the Lord when we sat by the Fleshpots and ate our fill of bread.
They were slaves, for heaven's sake.
Right. So instead of looking at that and jumping and doing what I'm inclined to do, which is judging the Israelites, what if I look at that and say, so what is making the Israelites say that? And again, using this framework that I'm bringing into this endeavor, I'm going to suggest that what makes them say that is that their system for meeting their needs isn't going to work in the circumstances that they find themselves in. And that's the only system they know. They don't know of another system for meeting their needs other than the one that they lived in Egypt.
Where probably their needs, they weren't being met fully because they were slaves, but what was given to them was probably just handed to them.
Right.
Yeah.
It came from something, it came from some source that was in some sense, it seems almost godlike. And initially it seems like the different system that God suggests resembles the one in Egypt, because in the system that God is suggesting, there again, something is going to be handed to them. But the differences are profound. In the Egyptian system, what is handed to them is the surplus grain, which they in fact themselves have cultivated and then handed over to Pharaoh because he forces them to do so, which Pharaoh then stores in huge granaries. We see those granaries all the way back in the book of Exodus. That's how these people wound up there to begin with. There was a famine in the land in the days of Jacob, and Jacob sent his sons down there because these huge granaries were famous all over the Middle East. Everybody knew there was grain there, far more grain than the people needed at any given time. So the basic principle of that Egyptian system is create a surplus. Create a surplus which can be stored and sold. And the selling is the thing that creates wealth. The selling then sends wealth up to the top, which is always Pharaoh or the king or the 1%. At any rate, that's the system. It looks like God is repeating that system, because Moses is told to tell the Israelites, look, every morning you're going to get what you need. The difference is, however, that there is no surplus at all. In fact, when people who still feel connected to that old system of having their needs met, that is, when people who still reach for surplus, when they do what's natural to them, and I'm going to suggest what's natural to us as well, when they do what's natural, when they reach for more, what happens?
It rots.
It rots. So in fact, the system that God is inviting them to embrace looks a little bit like that imperial pharaonic system, in that what they need is given to them. But the tremendous difference is that it does not rely on surplus. That's the system that God wants them to embrace relies on dependence, and not dependence on Pharaoh, not dependence on Pharaoh's granaries, but dependence on God's provision. That's the big difference between these two systems of having your needs met. Again, I would repeat that even though it's easy to say, oh, those ungrateful Hebrews, well, they just keep on complaining. And, and as we read into Numbers, this dynamic continues. The same basic thing is repeated in Numbers, except then God gets angry and he makes them eat quail until it comes out of their nostrils. So if I go back to my 4 questions, what do the people want? Well, they want something that resembles the economy that they understand, which is that you create a surplus and then you distribute that surplus to people who need it, and somebody makes a profit. And the reason they want that is because that's the only economy they know. Well, what does God want? Well, God wants them to step out of that way of meeting their needs and embrace another one. And I think that that's the point where the church writ large today, and perhaps us as individuals as well, sort of see our current moment in this ancient text, because I think that same invitation persists for us today. And I think that most of us, if we're really honest, react more or less the way the Israelites did. We're like, what do you mean I can't take more than I need right now? Okay, so now I'm going to suggest that we jump forward.
Mark, can I
yeah.
just say one thing? One thing that leapt out at me as I studied this passage is that the Israelites really had a justifiable complaint. I mean, they're in the desert. There isn't anything place where they can grow what they need. They really look around and see we can't depend on ourselves. There isn't any way to get the food that we need because there's nothing here.
Right.
And so when we try to think about them as being whiny or complaining, in some senses, they really did have a very justifiable complaint.
I would certainly have been pretty frightened in that circumstance. Yeah, there's no question. They're in dire straits. They really are. They really are in dire straits. One of the things that strikes me about God's response to them is that provision that anybody who takes more than he needs winds up not having extra. Anybody who doesn't take enough winds up having enough, and the surplus is eaten by worms.
Yeah.
And how long would it take any small group of them for that to make sense? How long would it take us? Are they going to get that in one day? Are they going to, it takes a long time to change that paradigm.
A long time.
And the other reality is often, no matter how bad the past was, because we know it better than we know this uncertain future, then we long to go back to it
Right,
rather than
right.
live into the uncertainties and the unknowableness
Uh,
of whatever lies ahead.
Uncertainties are the worst. When I'm meeting with people at the hospital and I ask them, what's the most difficult thing about their disease? And that's the answer: uncertainty.
Yeah.
Uncertainty is the worst. So yes, they have legitimate reason to be concerned. The only way that they understand to meet their needs is not available to them. And this thing that God seems to be proposing, like you certainly can't accept that overnight. So with all of that in mind, I'm going to suggest that we jump way forward. And as we turn forward to the book of First Kings, I'll sort of run through a very brief summary of the history that we're skipping. From the place where we see these Hebrew slaves having just been freed from Egypt, they will move into the promised land and they will eventually take it from the people who already live there. And they will eventually, through the process that Ellen Davis described, by becoming intimately acquainted with land that other people could not make prosperous, and passing that information on from generation to generation and meeting the needs of the place, they did eventually establish themselves and create a flourishing culture and a different kind of economy. Ultimately, that economy then imitated the one that it came out of. So the Hebrews escaped from control by Pharaoh. They escaped from the Egyptian empire and went through this process, which ultimately leads them into something that is almost a replica of the Egyptian empire. And that's where we find them at the beginning of First Kings. So let me see, what books of First Kings did I think we should read here? Let's begin in 3. Let's begin in chapter 3 of First Kings. The first couple of chapters of First Kings are the story of how Solomon consolidates power after his father David dies. And then at the beginning of chapter 3 in First Kings, we start to see some details about what Solomon's kingdom is like. Will somebody read from the beginning of chapter 3 in First Kings?
Solomon made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh. Whoa. Solomon made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her into the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. The people were sacrificing at the high places, however, because no house had yet been built for the name of the Lord. Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, only he sacrificed and offered incense at the high places. The king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the principal high place. Solomon used to offer 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, "Ask what I should give you." And Solomon said, "You have shown great and steadfast love to your servant, my father David, because he walked before you in faithfulness and righteousness and in uprightness of heart toward you. And you have kept for him this great and steadfast love, and have given him a son to sit on his throne today. And now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David. Although I am only a little child, I do not know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of the people whom you have chosen, a great people, so numerous they cannot be numbered or counted. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, able to discern between good and evil. For who can govern this, your great people?"
Hold on a second, Mary Lou. So what kind, does Solomon seem like a good guy? What do you think?
Well, right there he does, but he's already married to Pharaoh's daughter and made an alliance with him. So
It's a fascinating combination of up and down here, I think, or of affirmative and not affirmative, or of good. He begins by making a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, and we're like, you married Pharaoh's daughter?
right.
And
You know, and he's also, you know, worshiping at the high places, which weren't those Baal.
there's a whole lot of discussion about where worship should take place, and that is one of the primary concerns of the priestly group, that worship has to be consolidated in Jerusalem. And that's one of the reasons that Israel and Judah split. Then there's this portion at the end of what Mary Lou read. Now, O Lord, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, although I am only a little child. Is he a little child? Not a little child.
Well,
I do
no, he's married the Pharaoh's daughter.
I do not know how to go out or come in. What kind of speech is that? I'm just a little boy who doesn't know how to go out or come in, God. And your servant is in the midst of the people whom you have chosen, a great people, so numerous that they can't be known. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people and to discern between good and evil. For who can govern this great people? I'm deliberately reading that in a facetious tone, partly because I do wonder whether this is political speech. That's something that I've talked about quite a bit in the group that meets on Sunday morning that Mary Lou is part of. Do these people, if we could hear the tone of voice, we could more easily discern whether he's speaking sincerely here or not. So we have to add the tone ourselves. But with all those doubts in play, I still have to acknowledge that if I take what he says here at surface value, he's saying things that I would like him to say. He's saying things that I think a leader should say. So, like, there's a component of Solomon that I admire. There really is. And there appears to be a component of Solomon that God admires, because God responds to what Solomon says here in a pretty positive fashion. Will somebody read on from verse 10?
It pleases the Lord that Solomon had asked this. And God said to him, because you have asked this and have not asked for yourself long life or riches or the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right, behold, I now do according to your word. Behold, I give you a wise and discerning mind, so that men like you have been before you, so that none like you have been before you, and none like you shall rise after you. I give you also what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that no other king shall compare with you all your days. And it shall walk, and if you walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. And Solomon awoke, and behold, it was a dream.
What? It was a dream? Huh? Like, did God say that or not? Like, huh? In other words, there is, I think this is really, really sophisticated writing. And one of the things that makes it sophisticated is the different possibilities for meaning that jump out at us here. The different ways we can interpret what's being lifted up in front of us, all of which simply remits me to the point that I made at the outset, that this is not a recording of events. This is a construction which is meant to make sense. As Ellen Davis says, they're words which are supposed to create a kind of harmony between what we say about God and the material reality we find around us. That's what this is. And
well, that makes a lot more sense if it's a dream,
right,
the whole thing a dream, because otherwise it's just really contradicting his behavior.
Mhm. Right, it certainly is. So the he does not appear to be behaving by somebody who considers himself a little child who doesn't know how to go in and come out, or like somebody who mostly wants understanding. That doesn't appear to be what Solomon, that's not consistent with how he acts. And
Oh, and the message from God then is contradictory too, if it's not a dream. No one is as good as you. No one will ever be as good as you. You know, it's just,
absolutely, that's right. So the construing it as a dream then sort of allows us to step back from this and say, oh, well, that's a way to explain why so much of this seems to go against what we would expect.
And, you know, I mean, I grew up hearing about the wisdom of Solomon.
Right.
You know, that was the wisdom of Solomon. Well, that was one of the first myths that was just crushed when I got to Southwestern to college
Mhm.
and got into my first Bible course of Old Testament, the man course, Judy. I mean, I think it was Dr. Neal. I mean, you know, somebody said something about the wisdom of Solomon. He was like, oh, there was nothing wise about it.
He was certainly shrewd. I mean, it seems to me that he was a shrewd person. Wisdom is a different thing, I guess. The story that follows here immediately is like the stereotypical or paradigmatic story that shows his wisdom. I think that most of us know it. There are two women. They both do one child. So later, two women who were prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. One said, "Hey, please, my lord, this woman and I live in the same house. I gave birth while she was in the house. On the third day after I gave birth, this woman also gave birth. We were together. There was no one in the house with us. Then this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him. She got up in the middle of the night. She took my son while I was asleep, and she laid him at her breast, and she laid her dead son at my breast. And when I got up in the morning to nurse my son, I saw that he was dead. But I looked more closely and I realized, oh, that's not my son." But the other woman said, "No, no, the living son is mine. The dead son is yours." The first said, "No, no, the dead son is yours. The living one's mine." And so they argued before the king. Then the king says, well, one of you says this son that is alive is mine and your son is dead. And the other one says, no, no, your son is dead and mine is alive. So the king says, "Bring me a sword." And they brought a sword before the king. And the king said, "Divide the living boy in two and give half to one and half the other." And the woman whose son was alive said to the king, because compassion for her son burned within her, "Please, my lord, give her the living boy. Certainly do not kill him." And the other said, "It shall be neither mine nor yours. Divide it." And the king responded, "Give the first woman the living boy. Do not kill him. She is his mother." So this is the way he demonstrates his wisdom, etc. But the way he demonstrates his character, I think, is clearer to us in the following chapter. So if we look, for example, to chapter 4, I think that we can skip forward to chapter 4. Let's begin reading chapter 4 at verse 20. So Judah and Israel, remember these two kingdoms are still at this point joined under Solomon. Were as numerous as the sand by the sea. That's their way. That's the text's way of saying that they had confirmed God's promise to Abraham.
Yeah.
They ate and drank and they were happy. Solomon was sovereign over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines, even to the border of Egypt. In other words, Solomon is an emperor, sovereign over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of Egypt. So that's like from the east, from the border of Iraq and Iran today down to Egypt. It's a huge territory. Now, this is what it's like to live in Solomon's empire. Solomon's provision for one day was 30 cores of choice flour and 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen and 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fatted fowl. For he had dominion over all the region west of the Euphrates from Tipsha to Gaza, over all the kings west of the Euphrates, and he had peace on all sides. During Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel lived in safety, from Dan even to Beersheba, all of them under their vines and fig trees. Solomon also had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. Those officials supplied provisions for King Solomon and for all who came to King Solomon's table, each one in his month. They let nothing be lacking. They also brought the required place barley and straw for the horses and swift steeds, each according to his charge. God gave Solomon very great wisdom, discernment, breadth. So those are the things that Solomon had asked for. And breadth of understanding as vast as the sand of the seashore. That repetition is again a reminder. This is the fulfillment of the Abrahamic promise. So Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of the people. He is the thing that we've been aiming for, except he's also an emperor. He was wiser than anyone else, wiser than Ethan, wiser than, he composed 3,000 proverbs. His songs numbered 1,005. I like the 5. It wasn't just 1,000, it was 1,005. He'd speak of trees from the cedar that's in Lebanon, the hyssop. He'd speak of animals, reptiles, fish. People came from all the nations to hear Solomon speak. He's quite a guy. They came from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. So there is this aspect of the description of Solomon that lifts him up as something for us to admire. And again, as I've said, I think one of the things that makes the text so compelling is that he's not just a villain. We don't have just villains anymore or just heroes anymore. What we have is people who are good and bad. And that's what we have in Solomon. There's stuff about Solomon that's really, really noble and admirable. And then there's this economy that he creates. I'm going to skip again a little bit further because, as always, we're running out of time. Let's go to, what do we want to see here before we have to stop? Let's go to chapter 5, verse 13. So Solomon is involved in substantial building projects. He's quarrying stone in one part of the kingdom, and he's bringing cedars from Lebanon, and all of that building is done by
Forced labor.
That's right, not by contractors.
Slaves.
They're not called that, but that is in effect what they are. So chapter 5, verse 13, Solomon conscripted forced labor out of all Israel. Well, that is, if that's not mimicking Pharaoh, then I don't know what it is.
And it's exactly what Samuel told Saul
It's exactly right.
kings would do to you.
That's it. It's exactly what Samuel said that kings would do, and here it is. He levied the number 30,000 men. So he conscripted, not a few, 30,000 conscripted slaves, Israelites. They're not foreigners. They're his own people. He sent them to Lebanon, 10,000 a month in shifts. So shifts of 10,000 Hebrew slaves each month going to Lebanon. They would be a month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. Well, so they do get, some time off. It's not quite as bad as what it was in Egypt, but the economy or the system by which people meet their needs is the same. Adoniram was in charge of the forced labor. Solomon also had 70,000 laborers and 80,000 stone cutters in the hill country, besides Solomon's 3,300 supervisors who were over the work, having charge of the people who did the work. At the king's command, they quarried out great costly stones in order to lay the foundation of the house with dressed stones. There are 2 houses that Solomon builds. One is the temple, the great temple in Jerusalem, and the other is the palace. And if we were to read this carefully through, we would find that the description of building the temple is elaborate. The temple takes a long time and requires a lot of material. The building of the palace takes twice as long and requires twice as much material.
Wow.
So So yes, Solomon builds the great temple in Jerusalem, but he spends twice as much time, twice as much slave labor, and twice as much money on his own house. So again, I lift all of this up because I once again remind myself that the people who have composed this material as we see it today are looking back on these events, or looking back on their cultural memory, if you will, from a position in time that's far, far advanced, from a position in time that has seen this culture rise and has seen it fall. And they're deciding to tell us these things for some particular reason. And so I keep on asking myself, why do they want to tell us these things? And the best answer that I can come up with most days is something like, because they realize that the economy that they're lifting up in front of us now has both a positive, has a kind of attraction to it. We're excited by all of that success, by all of that opulence, by all of that production. And if that doesn't ring true, well, then I would invite us to look at America today. I think that America is, a place that is excited by this, by growth. And they also know that it is exactly this mindset which 150 years down the road produces disaster. So there's a whole lot more here that we can look at, that you can look at on your own, because we've reached the end of an hour and I don't want to compromise everyone's time. I'm going to invite you to read on in 1 Kings, read on the story of Solomon's temple, Solomon's kingdom on your own time. There's a really interesting story that's not about Solomon. It's about, I can't remember his name. Maybe it's Ahab in chapter 22 of 1 Kings. And then ultimately, what we're going to look at is the reaction of the prophets, who are people who look at this economy, at this culture, and say, it may have its attractions, but its underside is devastating the bedrock of what our culture is meant to be. So next week, that's where we will turn. We'll turn from this vision of imperial Israel, which is really an imitation of imperial Egypt. We'll turn from there to the first voices that speak out against this economy. And the first of those people is Amos. So Amos is the first prophet to stand up and say, hey, this empire that we have built is going to kill us. So we'll look briefly at Amos next week, and then we'll begin to turn our eyes towards the prophets who see a possibility for change. Because I think, as I said at the outset, one of the things one of the reasons that I'm interested in this is I think that we can find in it a way to think about change in our current moment that has a sort of 2,500-year-old resonance, because it reaches all the way back to the people who composed this text for us to read. So my thanks to all of you for joining this this endeavor tonight. And if you want to continue, we'll continue next week. I think that we're currently scheduled to resume Tuesday meetings next week. My schedule is actually more flexible at this point than what I had imagined. And since Stefan is not able to continue with us, it's just my schedule, not his and mine. So if Wednesday night is not good, I can shift to another night. But for now, we're scheduled for Tuesday. So unless somebody lifts up the motion to move to another day.
Well, could we meet again on, the next 2 Tuesdays, I have commitments.
I can stick to Wednesday. As I said,
Back to Wednesday?
I can stay on Wednesday.
Go back to Wednesday, okay.
But if-
I
I have house church next Wednesday, so
Oh, well,
I would not, but I mean, that, if other people can do next Wednesday, that's fine, but my house church is meeting
are they at 8?
6:30.
Oh, never mind then. Oh, well,
Well, let's ponder that for now. And
Yeah.
I'll-
I mean, I don't want to change it either just because of me, but anyway.
well,
And
I'll-
I don't, if Wednesdays works for everybody else better, that's fine, but I do have house church, so.
I'll send you all an email, let's say on Monday, and we'll make a decision then.
yeah.
All right?
So we all,
Sounds good.
we know to show up, right? Okay.
All right.
I'll put a question mark here then. Thank you so much, Mark.
All right.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Here. All right.
Good
See
night,
you.
all.
Night.
Night.